Hey guys, Jeremy here with KISS Aquatic Systems. KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. So today we are going to talk about Hillstream Loach breeding. Start with the spawning process, and then move on to fry and fry development. What you can see here are some of my juvenile Hillstream Loaches, born and raised in this tank. I mostly keep the reticulated Hillstream Loach species, which is Sewellia lineolata, which is probably one of the most popular and commonly available Hillstream Loach species in the hobby. These fish are sought after both for their interesting colors and patterns, interesting brown and yellow almost stripes, and also for their behavior. So this species is particularly boisterous and courageous for a small Hillstream Loach. As you can see here, these guys are enjoying some leftover algae wafer that their parents were kind enough to leave behind. And they're probably about 6 or 7 months old. Not quite fry anymore, but not quite adults yet either. It'll probably take another 4 or 5 months for these fish to reach adulthood. So if you're new to fish breeding in general, Hillstream Loaches are not a bad place to get started and get your feet wet. There's 4 main reasons for this. 1, if your Hillstream Loaches are happy and healthy, they will spawn on their own, and there really isn't anything you need to do to trigger it. 2, unlike some other fish, like for instance koi, the whole spawning process is really not all that stressful or dangerous for the females. The chasing is all pretty harmless, and they don't really get injured ever during the spawn, which is nice. 3, Hillstream Loaches really exhibit exactly 0 parental care for the eggs or the fry, which means you don't have to worry about any sort of aggression or territoriality after the spawn, as you would in some fish like, for instance, cichlids or betas. And finally, Hillstream Loaches, from what I've seen, have a much lower prey drive than many other small fish, which means they will not be as aggressive hunting out and eating their eggs or their fry. So what that means for you is that you could have a pretty good survival rate of fry in your main display tank without having to separate out the eggs or the fry from the parents, which really does make life a lot easier. So for all these reasons, Hillstream Loach breeding is actually a fairly hands-off and relaxed and easy process. So let's start off with the spawning itself. As I said before, there really isn't anything you need to do to get your fish to spawn. If they're healthy, if they're happy, and very importantly, if you have both males and females in your tank, then they will spawn on their own. It may take a bit of time though, so you may have to be patient. This tank has been up and running for about 2 years now. And in the first year, I had very, very little spawning activity. And I actually only had a single fry make it to adulthood. But in the second year, these fish have spawned really almost every single day. And I have a ton of fry, and many of them are doing really great. So it took a little time to get going, but once they started, they really haven't looked back. Probably the main reason why it may take a bit of time for your loaches to settle in and start spawning in your tank is because these fish are often sold in a weakened and emaciated state. The vast majority of Hillstream loaches that you see available for sale are wild caught, not tank raised. So these fish don't know how to eat pellets or any other commercially available food, and it may take them several months to learn how. And even if they discover a taste for pellets, they will not compete with other fish for them. What these fish really need in the beginning and throughout their lives is a rich biofilm of algae and other microorganisms coating most of the surfaces in the tank that they can graze off of. And the truth is, these conditions really aren't found very often in most wholesaler or retailer tanks. So, depending on how long those fish have been sitting at the store, they probably have not been eating. So, it could take quite a bit of time to build them up and get them in good spawning condition. With the adults that I purchased, the coloration was often much lighter and more faded than what you will expect for a healthy, happy fish. And the fish are very thin. So in the first, call it 3 to 4 months of owning these fish, I have seen them double in width and darken up considerably to the point where the browns are often almost black and the yellows are much darker as well. So when you get these fish, you really do want to and should see quite a transformation in their whole appearance and even shape. And that probably needs to happen before they will even think about spawning. Again, also really helps to have both males and females in your tank. So there's a couple different ways to sex these guys, but for me the easiest way is to just look at the shape of the fins. The male's fins in this particular species will be a lot boxier, and the female's fins will be a lot more rounded. So very easy to tell at a glance how many of each sex you have. So as I said before, Hillstream loach spawning really is just a matter of letting them acclimate and settle in and fill out from eating good nutritious foods. But there are a few things you could do to speed along the process, which I think is common for many other fish. So you can perhaps trigger a spawn by doing a very large water change, or even raising the temperature by maybe 4 or 5 degrees over a few day period. Hillstream loaches and fish in general are often seasonal spawners, and things like changes in water temperature or other parameters will often tell these fish that the seasons are changing and may or may not trigger a spawning response. Doesn't hurt to try from time to time. Obviously, you don't want to be messing around with your parameters too often because stability is really important for pretty much any fish. Another thing that I noticed is one time I dosed my tank with some spirulina powder just to see what happened. And a couple of days later, the fish were spawning like crazy. So I guess with the spirulina, introduced an explosion of something in the tank, some sort of algae or microorganism that these fish were feeding off of, and that triggered a spawning response. A bit of an off-the-run way to do it, but that seems to have worked for me. But again, overall, spawning is pretty easy. It should be expected if these fish are healthy and settled in. Now, what does spawning actually look like? Well, it starts, as with many other fish and humans, with males chasing after females. If the male can catch the female, it will typically land right next to her, and then it will circle her while wiggling. So that is the courtship display of Hillstream loaches. And they've actually got some pretty good dance moves. And clearly, circle making is a very important life skill for Hillstream loaches. So this can go on for really hours, actually. And if the female is receptive, then the fish will spawn. Now, you have to be either very patient or very lucky to actually see the spawn itself happen, because the whole process only takes a few seconds. So the way it works in my tank is the male and female will detach from whatever surface they happen to be on and will swim out into the water column, typically holding themselves against the current of one of the power heads. And then they'll actually wrap around each other in the open water, and the female will release her eggs, and the male will release his milt. And the eggs will be fertilized in the water itself, which is fairly common for fish. Now, the fish eggs really look like tiny little caviar. I mean, they're fish eggs. Very small, translucent to white eggs. And I haven't found them to be all that sticky. I've never seen them stick to the glass. They typically settle in the gravel bed very quickly, which I guess is a good thing because that's where the fry will probably spend the first month of their lives. So if you see these fry for the first week or so, they are really, really tiny. They kind of look like tiny little tadpoles, and they'll spend the first few weeks of their lives hiding in the gravel bed, feeding off of the detritus and associated microorganisms that live in the sort of mulm that you'll typically see in a mature gravel bed. So for me, this is where I notice the most losses. Not so much from the parents hunting and eating them, but more so from getting sucked up into the water and killed by power heads, which was actually a pretty big problem for me for a while. So I have a flow rate of 25 times per hour in this tank, and the water moves in a whirlpool fashion. Very easy for these tiny little guys in the first few weeks of their lives to get sucked up into the water column and not have the energy to be able to swim back down into the gravel. So what I did was I took really just a handful or two of additional gravel and tried to create some lower current, lower flow areas of the gravel bed where the fry could live and eat in peace without having as much risk of getting sucked up. And just adding a small amount of additional gravel increased my fry survival rate dramatically. So little things really can make a big difference in terms of managing flow in your tank and creating places for the very, very young fry to hide. After the first couple weeks, these fry start to look a little bit more like fish and less like larvae. So they'll start to develop some darker splotches on their bodies and reach maybe half a centimeter in length in a few weeks. At this point, they're a lot more comfortable actually leaving the gravel bed and eating some of the same things as their parents will eat. They'll start grazing off of a bit of algae, usually the softer algae. They'll even pick at some pellets, and will start eating spinach. Also, at this point, there really isn't any more risk of them getting sucked up by the power heads. And they're usually too big, even when they're only about half a centimeter, for the parents to eat. So from this point on, I have experienced really little or zero mortality. These fish, even when they're really tiny, can actually be shockingly bold. They will sit on the rocks with the parents, and the parents will usually ignore them. I got nervous for a while when I started seeing it happen, but I've never once seen a adult loach eat or even try to eat the fry. So if you've seen adult Hillstream loaches, they really do have really tiny little mouths. Not that easy for them to eat their own fry after a few weeks. Now, the fry will look quite different from their parents. Even now, you can see my juvenile loaches are quite a bit longer and thinner than the adult loaches look. So the adults have that sort of trademark button shape, where they have two pairs of lateral fins that are overlapping and rounded. But that's not the case with fry. Usually you have two very discrete pairs of fins that over time move closer and closer together, but initially they sort of look like tiny little lizards. Not as great at handling currents as the adults, but they still do a decent job. And over time, as they start looking more and more like adult loaches, they can get comfortable in higher and higher flow rates. So yeah, that's really all for raising fry. The danger period really is the first few weeks of their lives, when they were at risk of getting sucked up by powerheads and also probably predation. But once they've passed that stage and start eating the same foods that adult loaches are, then they really generally do great and are pretty bulletproof. Again, it takes about 6 months to get to the stage where these fish are now, and another 4 or 5 months to get to adulthood. Overall, a very interesting and entertaining process to watch, and really doesn't require really any work or any changes on your part to have a successful breeding colony of Hillstream loaches. The fish are happy, and you have a nice mature substrate with lots of gravel for the fry to hide. All you really have to do is sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. So thanks, guys. That's all on Hillstream loach breeding for now. Take care and hope you enjoyed the video.